I think this is an important debate facing the left in terms of how to relate to the Bernie Sanders campaign. Someone calling himself a socialist, getting a mass audience, but running within the pro-capitalist, corporate-controlled Democratic Party. It raises a whole series of strategic and tactical questions for the left that can be recurring and relate to a whole series of movements. So, with that brief introduction, I want to tell folks how this debate's going to be structured. There's already been a series of written debates between Socialist Alternative and the ISO's leadership. Those written debates are going to continue. We want to leave room here for a sharp exchange because there are serious issues at hand, but also a comradely exchange with an atmosphere of respect. So the way we're going to have it structured here is Philip from Socialist Alternative is going to lead off for 15 minutes. Then Jen from the ISO is going to lead off for 15 minutes. Then we'll have room for crowd discussion. I want that crowd discussion to be balanced in terms of the different trends on the left in the room and the different opinions on the left in the room. And then we'll go back to Jen and Philip for sum-ups. My name's Bryan, by the way. I'm Socialist Alternative's national organizer, so I obviously have a side in this debate. But I'm going to
Ridiculously fair.
I'm gonna try to chair in a very even-handed way, despite my own political views. So, with that being said, I will hand it over to Philip. Now, where should I move to somewhere? Sure. That's great.
Okay, yes, Bryan, I really want to thank everyone for coming and really thank Jen and the ISO for agreeing to do this discussion. As Bryan said, I think it's an important debate and a challenging issue that the socialist left has been confronted with the rise of Bernie Sanders' campaign. How, as socialists, as Marxists, we relate to this campaign, which obviously has, I think we would all agree, has a number of very exciting features of it, of the millions of people who have been energized and politicized by Sanders, call for a political revolution against the billionaire class, hundreds of thousands coming to rallies, millions donating, Sanders taking up a pretty bold left populist program of a $15 hour minimum wage, single-payer health care, breaking up the big banks, taxing the rich, free public education through, including public university, and a number of other things, including on criminal justice, saying in his first term, I think for a mainstream presidential candidate, I think it's undeniable, it's rare and exciting to have a credible presidential candidate saying in their first term they would pledge that there'd be more people attending colleges, universities, and in jail, unlike the current insane status we have with the U.S. having the largest prison population in the world. At the same time, socialists recognizing that the Democratic Party is a party as the billionaire class, to put it in the terms that Bernie Sanders calls it, or as we would traditionally call it, a party of big business, of corporate America, and a central pillar of U.S. capitalism. And Sanders running as a Democrat, how do socialists relate to that? And I think it's a useful discussion, and I think it's been valuable, the discussion we've already had, and I hope, today, while, as Bryan said, there's serious disagreements about this, and I think they relate. We should discuss the issue in itself, but I think they also relate to a larger method, which is important for rebuilding the socialist left. And I think there's methodological issues involved which have bearing not just on this issue, but how would we learn from this experience? What lessons do we draw for the socialist left, a very small and weak socialist left? How do we make a breakthrough in the next period? A period that promises, in our view, to be extremely exciting, a very turbulent period of upheaval, of struggle, of radicalization. How can the small forces of Marxism actually relate to those developments, given that with socialists usually not leading the kind of radicalization and movements that will develop? And how can we actually build a substantial, powerful socialist movement that can have real influence, but avoid the pitfalls of opportunism and reformism, and maintain a principled position and build support for revolutionary politics? And that's at least the spirit that Socialist Alternative is looking at this. And I think, a starting point for myself is introducing the discussion, just start summarizing at least how Socialist Alternative has approached this issue. And I think one thing is, from the point of view, one thing we are in reviewing our position, we think events have really borne out is our analysis. from a very early position, and it'd be worth comparing what different organizations, different trends on the left said about Bernie Sanders, not now, but a year ago and 2 years ago. 2 years ago, Socialist Alternative was raising that there was an enormous potential for an anti-corporate left-wing challenge to the political establishment, and that Bernie Sanders was a unique figure in politics who had a certain standing, a certain profile. He was publicly discussing, in 2014, he was discussing whether to run as an independent or as a Democrat, and we highlighted that and oriented towards that, and actually publicly intervened in that discussion, demanding, urging Bernie to run, yes, to run on a clear working class program, to reject corporate money, but also to reject corporate politics, to run on an independent basis, and said that if he did do that, we expected he would have a major impact, that he would be able to reach millions of people. Far more important than his subjective, his intentions, he would unleash a process that would be very important of politicizing millions of people, bringing them into political struggle, and would have the potential to be there for the strongest left challenge in decades to the two parties of big business. Unfortunately, as we know, Sanders did not take that course. He decided to run as a Democrat. And our organization, I think I want to be quite clear, was I think made no bones about it. I'm going to read what we said exactly a little more than a year ago when Sanders first announced. We said, if I can find it, well, I'm not going to find it right now, but we said it was a fundamental mistake for Bernie Sanders to run in the Democratic Party, that we completely disagree with that we'd urged him to run as independent, and that we think he made a fundamental mistake in doing that. At the same time, we also recognized, and I think events have actually borne this out more than we expected, that despite that mistake, we expected that his campaign would be the central rallying point for the political discontent in the U.S. in 2015 and 2016, that he would be running a radical anti-corporate pro-worker campaign, that he would mobilize millions of people, and that for all those who are interested in fighting for the ideas of independent class politics, for the ideas of independent left politics, for socialism, whether we liked it or not, it was not the situation we created. We urged him to run as an independent, but whether we liked it or not, that socialists, a key part of the Marxist method has to be starting with reality, and what are the objective trends in society, and then how do we relate to it. We argued that the central arena for discussion of people who are moving to the left, who would be open to independent left politics, who are looking for an alternative to corporate politics, would be in and around the Bernie Sanders campaign, and we argued that the socialist left needed to be rooted in that, go through that process with those millions of people who would be learning through that experience, and patiently but honestly explaining at each stage the Democratic Party is a big business party, is a party of U.S. imperialism, and that a new party, a party for working people, had to be built, and that had to be linked to a thoroughgoing, consistent socialist program. We also explained in that we thought on the whole, having a balanced assessment, Sanders was running on a pronouncedly left basis, but of course there were real programmatic deficiencies with Sanders. His vision of, he doesn't talk that much about socialism, but the media calls him a socialist, and to his credit, he didn't duck the issue, he would defend it, he wouldn't downplay, say, no, I'm not a socialist. He said, yeah, I'm a socialist, what's wrong with that? That's a usually positive thing that he did that. But we should be clear, we have no illusions. His view of socialism is a social democratic vision of trying to reform, have a kinder, gentler capitalism. We want to build, we think it's welcome that there's a discussion about socialism taking place in the US. We think it's positive that he's helped provoke that, but we want to step into that discussion and explain idea of fundamental socialist change, of system change, of breaking up the power of big business and replacing that with a new, fundamentally different social order of workers' control, workers' power, international socialism. But also we were clear about the political weaknesses of his campaign, whether it was initially on Black Lives Matter, though through pressure of the BLM movement, his position has improved. It's not perfect, but it's improved, or his position on foreign policy, which is actually the weakest part of his campaign. We were quite clear about those things. But we also recognized that on the whole, we had to have a sense of proportion that his campaign was going to be a rallying cry for the best layers of workers and young people in the U.S. But the key issue, in our view, was not the programmatic issues or his vision of socialism, but was that he was running as a Democrat and was going to promote illusions and stimulate hopes that the Democratic Party could be so-called reclaimed. We don't think it ever was a vehicle for progressive change or for working people, but that was the kind of outlook that the Sanders campaign would. And we argued, actually, here I found the article I was talking from when he first launched. We said Sanders' campaign is heading for a political crisis in 2016, when he will need to choose between supporting the Democratic nominee or continue running in the general elections. because we argued he would not be able to win the Democratic primaries because they are fundamentally slant in the direction of corporate politics. Socialists need to build the strongest possible base among Sanders supporters in preparation for this debate. A strong left current can mobilize Sanders supporters to demand Bernie continues running or lead as much of the campaign as possible away from the Democrats if Bernie insists on endorsing Clinton. And I think that's been a common thread of our approach, is that there's an audience, there's an opportunity of a fresh layer of young people and workers who are sick and tired of Hillary Clinton, of corporate Democrats, of the political establishment. And when we've raised the idea we need a new party, when Shama Sawant spoke to 15,000 people in Seattle, and Bernie Sanders had his rally there and argued boldly that the Democrat and Republican parties are servants of the billionaire class, that there's a time for a new party, got a huge applause, saying that we should run independent candidates who, like Bernie, don't take any corporate money. They're also independent of the two parties of big business. That got a huge response. To campaign for that, we've launched the petition, which I hope everyone's seen, movementforbernie.org. Over 30,000 people have signed this petition demanding that Bernie does not endorse Hillary Clinton, which is the course that he's currently set on and that he's said very clearly he's wanted. But we've tried to mobilize people in contrast to that to say, no, we're not going to go along with that. We think Bernie should continue running as an independent and use that as a tool to begin building a new political party, that he could run a campaign to get 5, 10, 15 million votes in the general election as an independent. Now, I'm running, that took longer than I thought, but we've also, I think a central issue where there's been some debate between our organizations is, I think we have to be clear, what's exciting and a challenge about the Sanders phenomenon is there's a fresh audience of new people who are not familiar with the debates that we're currently having, who are just entering into politics, who are getting involved in the Sanders campaign, and they support Bernie, and many of them, our experience has been, well, it makes sense that he ran as a Democrat, but then you ask them about the Democratic Party, they say, I hate the Democratic Party. There's this contradictory consciousness amongst many of his supporters. There's a fresh audience there, and most of them are not organized. Most of them not drawn full conclusions. At the same time, there's an organized layer in the Sanders campaign around Bernie Sanders and other left-wing Democrats who have a very conscious agenda. They want to mobilize these fresh forces into the Democratic Party, into a project of trying to reform the Democratic Party, pushing it to the left, running left-wing candidates inside the Democratic Party. We are completely against that agenda. We think we need the whole momentum, the whole enthusiasm, the whole political demands of the Sanders campaign, its program, its funding, its trajectory, points towards challenging corporate politics, challenging big business, and organizing on our own strength, independently on the political arena and obviously critically through social movements. There's an audience, it's a contested terrain. Those fresh people could be one, or a section of them, not all of them, but a section of them could be one to our view. And there's also, they're open to being one to the view of those who want to reform the Democratic Party. And our view, it's a dereliction of duty, which I think most of the far left, and I have to say, I think the ISO also has made a fundamental mistake of not being part of that debate, of abstaining from that, not engaging in it, and leaving the terrain. I know the criticism would be that we're supporting a Democratic candidate. I would turn that around and say, what does the left wing of the Democratic Party want? Your position or ours? I think our position has caused far more trouble for left-wing Democrats than a position of standing outside of the Bernie Sanders campaign and letting them have free reign of an audience of millions of new people that they can channel and corral into their project of reforming the Democratic Party. What Socialist Alternative has done is actively enter into that debate and concretely challenge the idea that the Democratic Party in any way is a vehicle for progressive change, in any way is a vehicle for the left, is any way a vehicle for working people, and have fought to win fresh forces from the Bernie Sanders campaign to the perspective of independent working class politics, to the perspective of genuine socialism, of an internationalist outlook, of movement building, and of course that requires a positive approach of welcoming the positive aspects of the Sanders campaign, why people are mobilizing behind it, but linking it, elaborating a program for independent politics. And I think if the left was to adopt the position that the ISO has argued for, and unfortunately I think most of the radical left has adopted that position, the end result has been Bernie Sanders has no problem with that. That makes his life easy. If he has a fresh audience who's naive and unorganized, and he has an organized wing of pro-Democratic Party supporters who can easily say, thank you very much, come this way. What he would not like, if there was a strong left in his campaign that was lighting a fire under him, bringing real pressure to bear, saying, you should run as independent. No way are we going to support Hillary Clinton. No way are we supporting the Democratic Party. We support your campaign as a step towards building a new political force in this country and dragging him as far as possible. Or, let's be clear, we don't expect Bernie Sanders to take that step. If he fails to take the necessary steps, we drag as many of his supporters to draw the correct conclusion. And we expect, unfortunately, Sanders will be endorsing Clinton, and we want to use the momentum we've created around the left wing of the Sanders campaign to argue for those people to support Jill Stein as a step. Not that we think the Green Party or Jill Stein is the end-all or be-all, and if we're going to talk about political deficiencies, they have serious political deficiencies as well, and do not have a rounded out in any way socialist outlook, but they would be a step towards people voting for Jill Stein would be a way of registering a protest, a left-wing protest against the two parties of big business, and a step towards an independent left political project. And I'll say, just from our experience, I'm visiting here from Seattle, where we helped launch the Sanders campaign last summer, and we had over several months open meetings, and at each one of those meetings, the normal Bernie Sanders organizers wanted to keep it non-political, just wanted to do it to just talk about phone banking and signing people up. We mobilized. We had at each one of those meetings last summer over 100 people, fresh people that we had not seen before, and we were able to politicize those meetings by having discussions about single-payer health care, about the TPP, about Black Lives Matter. In each of those meetings, we pointed out, if you're against the TPP, I'm sorry, Barack Obama and the Democratic Party is not your friend. In Washington State, both the Democratic Party senators voted for the TPP. I think it's very similar here in New York, where you have Schumer and Gillibrand, I think, are supporters of the TPP, or on Black Lives Matter, et cetera, and argue the case for independent politics. The left-wing Democrats in the room hated it. They did not appreciate our presence there, arguing for people to join us in building an independent political movement, signing them up, saying, the whole thrust of Sanders' campaign is contradictory to your aim of reforming the Democratic Party. How is that a viable strategy? And they also hated it when we warned them, we hope you can prove us wrong, we will see, but we think you will not win the Democratic primaries. We think you will be defeated, not because your ideas are not popular, or Sanders' ideas, but because it's fundamentally a corporate structure. And when you lose, if we're right, draw the necessary conclusions. Join us in building a new political party. They did not appreciate that being added to their meetings. They much preferred that we were outside, not being part of it. And I can also report, and not just in Seattle, in New York, in many other parts of the country, we had enormous success. It wasn't just that we were saying that and they didn't like it. The fresh people were very hungry for those ideas and signed up for it. So I know I'm out of time. I'll just end, and I'm sure in the discussion, when I come back, we'll be maybe be able to elaborate on this a little more. But I do think, as I started with, I think this points to some important. I think it's it's an issue that we can. It's not the end. It's not the be-all and end-all. The Bernie Sanders campaign. The left will move on. There'll be other struggles. We'll continue to be working together on issues that we agree on. There'll be issues we disagree. But I think what's important about this is to learn is what lessons the left draws from this experience to be armed to be effective when there's going to be. The reality is, unfortunately, future upheavals, future upsurges in struggle are not going to be pure and clean. They're going to have a confused character, like we've seen with Bernie Sanders, where there's progressive elements, and they're also led by sometimes much more dubious elements than Bernie Sanders. And how does the Marxist left, how do socialists effectively, skillfully connect with the healthy elements there, open up a real dialogue with them, work together hand in hand with them, build a real base, while at the same time not bending an inch to the false ideas, the wrong program the leaders of those movements will have? How do we concretely bring real pressure to bear and mobilize a left-wing challenge to those leaders? I think the Sanders campaign is an important test, and it's something that if we can learn from and develop out of, I think the left will be better prepared for future battles.
And he kept it between 15 and 16 minutes, so hopefully.
All right. Okay, so 4:10. Okay. So I appreciate you guys putting this together. I want to start with the things we agree on. The first of which is that I don't think this is just about the Sanders campaign, but is about a method for how the left approaches social struggles, how it approaches the question of the Democratic Party, etc. I think the other thing we agree on is that the Sanders campaign is in fact historic, not unprecedented, but historic in the sense of what it has raised in terms of focusing and very much putting on display the broad working class discontent and really youth rebellion that's going on in this country. The way it's popular, it's not just taking advantage of the opening for socialism, but it's also helping to popularize ideas of socialism amongst mass numbers of people. And I think we would agree, you didn't mention this, but I think we would agree that the Sanders campaign is not a phenomenon that stands on its own, but actually is a reflection and a product of a whole series of struggles that have taken place since the economic recession, from the occupation of the Capitol building in Madison, Wisconsin, to Egypt, to Occupy here, the Black Lives Matter movement, et cetera. That this is the latest really expression of the class anger that is growing in this country. But I do think there are real differences, and those are worth talking about. So I think I'll focus on a lot of the same questions from a different point of view. Philip mentioned that we've had an exchange in our papers, and there's going to be another round of exchanges. I'm going to quote from your forthcoming exchange, where you say, Sanders had said he will respect the outcome of the Democratic primaries and support Clinton if she is the nominee. This would transform the dominant character of his campaign from a rebellion against corporate America into a left-wing prop for an establishment candidate. What I want to say about that is that I don't think it's that there will be a transformation if he supports Hillary Clinton. The reality is that his campaign has had that dual character all along, and that's something that the left has to grapple with, is that even as he's building on that support, even as the dominant character is the super rallies, is the excitement, no one can watch the ads of Erica Garner or the Immokalee workers without, I cried, watching them. So that is the dominant character right now. But contained within that, at the same time, is that he is a left-wing prop for an establishment candidate. That's not something that's going to happen in July. That is something that's been in the campaign the entire time along. And I think that poses real questions for us. So before I talk about what I think the problem with that is, I want to say that many people on the left, I'm not sure I would agree that the radical left have all concluded that we need to stand aside from the Sanders campaign. I would argue that the biggest problem is that the most sizable forces on the left have actually supported the Sanders campaign. That has been my experience. And I think people have concluded that you have to be part of the campaign in order to relate to this phenomenon. We had a debate, with Jacobin and DSA back in December, where Bhaskar was like, we need to be able to relate to these people. We need to be in the campaign in order to do that. I would just say that I don't agree with that, and that hasn't been our experience as the ISO. To be honest, even if it did isolate us, I think that it would be important for us to maintain what we see as a necessary principled position in relationship to capitalist parties. But the reality is that it hasn't cut us off from people at all, precisely because many of the people gravitating towards Sanders do have these questions about the Democratic Party. They do loathe Hillary Clinton. They've been through the last 8 years of Obama and want to know how it is that we elected a Democrat and still the police kill black people with impunity on the streets of this country. And so when you say to people, I love what Sanders is saying, I think these are important things for us to fight for, but my problem with him is that he's running in the Democratic Party, and that's why I'll fight alongside you on all these issues, but I'm not going to join you in voting for Sanders. That hasn't cut me off from anyone. The ISO has seen large numbers at our meetings. We've seen people coming around. I was just having a discussion yesterday with one of the lead Bernie organizers from UVM. I sent her to the building a new student left meeting. But she has been campaigning for Bernie. She's organized, she repainted the school bus and is driving it all over the country campaigning for Bernie this summer. And we had like a 6-hour, she's been coming to our meetings every single week of the ISO, and we started talking about what will happen, if Sanders loses. And she's like, I'll vote for Jill Stein, but if he wins, I'm gonna vote for Sanders. And we pursued that discussion, and we talked about, is Sanders building a movement? And she was like, I'm really listening to what you have to say, because I'm grappling with these things too, and I'm afraid that I'm putting my words in Sanders' mouth and hoping he'll do something I want him to do that he's not going to do. That's the kind of conversation you can have with people. I went on a tour to Seattle and Portland a couple weeks ago, doing meetings on getting from a moment to a movement, talking about how you build a socialist movement. And in every meeting, there were people, Sanders supporters, who were like, what do I do next? Do I write in Bernie? Do I vote for Sanders? And you can engage with that discussion with people. So I would just say that, and it's very easy to go set up many tables, you know what I mean, at Sanders rallies all over the country and talk to many people. I don't think you have to be in the campaign to do that. However, I do think that by joining the campaign in order to relate to people comes at a cost. And I think it's an impossible position to say you're campaigning for Sanders and supporting Sanders, but that you're not helping to sign people up for the Democratic Party. Like, Philip, in that exchange last year, you said, we will not sign people up for the Democratic Party. But the signs, like in New York, the super rallies were like, vote for Sanders, build the Sanders campaign. How do you do that in New York? You have to register for the Democratic Party. There's no way, we don't have open primaries, and most don't, and that's a whole other discussion. But you have, that means that you are registering people for the Democratic Party, and they're the much more organized force than our side is. I mean, to be honest, I don't actually think the Democrats or Bernie are particularly concerned with what position the ISO or Socialist Alternative takes. I mean, I don't. That's not their measuring stick. But in September and October, those people that have registered for the Democrats, many of whom are independents who are suspicious of the Democratic Party, like when Trump is on the TV every night being Trump, oh my God, and Hillary's like, I know you don't love me, but you gotta vote for me, and you're getting text messages and phone calls and door knocks every week because you signed up at some Washington Square rally for Sanders. Who's gonna have the bigger voice with those people? It's not gonna be me, and it's not gonna be you guys. It's gonna be the Democratic Party machine. To the extent that we win people away from that is the extent that we've had a principled discussion all the way along with people about what's gonna happen. And I think it's too contradictory for words to say you're supporting Sanders but then independent of the Democratic Party. So I think that it ends up compromising you in a way that's actually not necessary. And I think the structure of the campaign, I think it's great that Socialist Alternative in Seattle, where has large numbers, I think, in Seattle, like a lot of your membership is there, that you can have big meetings that talk about issues. That's not the structure of the campaign. The Sanders campaign, it's not a movement. It's an electoral phenomenon. Sanders is not leaving behind committees in every county and every town that are talking about what do we do after Sanders loses, the way, by the way, like Nader did in 2000. It's not that kind of a phenomenon. It's possible that in some places like Seattle or New York, if we took that position, we could have those kinds of meetings and build that. But again, the cost that comes for the left to abandon a long-standing principle around the Democratic Party, I think, is too great a cost, and it doesn't cut you off from people. It doesn't cut you off from that discussion. I want to say something about the petition from Shama Sawant and from Movement for Bernie calling on Bernie to run as an independent. I think the problem with that is that we all know that he's not going to do that. And we knew that 2 years ago. Bernie has been working with the Democratic Party for 20 years. He's not going to change all of a sudden. He's not a movement leader responsive to the pressure from below of what it is that we're doing. His goal all along was very, very clear. His goal is to carve out a left-wing space within the Democratic Party to try to pull the Democrats to the left, to use his influence to increase his standing in Congress, and to build a slate of candidates that will try to create a de Blasio, Elizabeth Warren kind of wing of the Democratic Party nationally. Now, if that's your strategy, then it makes sense to support Sanders' campaign. And I don't agree with the people who are for an inside-outside strategy or a progressive Democratic strategy, but I can understand the logic of their position. But for us for us to get behind a petition that's you need to run as an independent now, to be honest, I think that just it helps to feed the understandable hope and illusion that people have that something different is going to come out of this than we know is going to come out of this. And that doesn't mean that you mock people. It doesn't mean that you're dismissive of their hopes. It doesn't mean that you don't say to people, it would be great if there was an independent campaign that comes out of this. But it does mean you're honest with people about the 80-year experience of the left and social movements in the Democratic Party. And I think the people who are coming moving into action right now, and the best people in the Sanders campaign, they have that question themselves before we even get to them. You know what I mean? They themselves are asking what it's going to take to do that, and it's just not as simple as let's just take, a wing of the Sanders campaign and boom, we have an independent party. The blockages to that are much, much greater. And I think that, in terms of like what are the prospects for independent politics, I think there's a broad disaffection with the Democratic Party. I think we would agree with that. The Bernie or bust phenomenon, there's like 100,000 people who signed on to that. There's 30,000 people who've signed on to your guys' petition for him to call independent. There's a lot of people I talk to who are like, I can never vote for Hillary. Now, I think there's a lot that's going to happen between now and November, and that's not a dig on anybody. It's to say that in the absence of viable social movements, in the absence of a sense of our own power, people are always going to try to take the most defensive action that they can. And that defensive action is going to be voting for Hillary Clinton for most people. That doesn't mean there's not an audience. I think there's an audience for the left to talk about independent politics. I don't think that's just about building an independent party. I think that's an audience to talk about how do we rebuild a movement against racism. Like, how is it that we put tens of thousands of people on the streets across this country in the last 2 years, and yet they get away with shooting people still? And there's no movement to speak of anymore. Like, where are those protests? You know what I mean? Like, how is it that we're going to sort of challenge austerity and begin to rebuild something? And so that really gets me, and I'm like got my last 3 minutes, I think, 4. The bigger question, I think, which is what are the challenges facing our side and what's it going to take to overcome them? Because the Sanders phenomenon, as I said, is not a singular phenomenon. Like, you think about Occupy and how quickly that spread and the anger that tapped into. I remember being on the streets after the Eric Garner decision came down and like being with 40,000 people on the streets of New York City and taking over the West Side Highway and people being like, shut it down. And it wasn't this like slogan the way it is now, like when 10 people say it, shut it down. It was like people were like, we need to figure out a way to build power for our side. And then we got pushed back. And that's what's happened in every struggle. The immigrant rights movement, Occupy, Madison, oh my computer turned off. You go through all those different things. And what's the challenge facing our side? It's a challenge of politics and organization. It's that the left isn't big enough, that we're not able to assert an independent voice that can be a place for people to come in and debate and discuss strategy about how we move forward, that can figure out how do you confront the repression when they shut down the Occupy encampments and continue to build a movement politically. What do we say about the nature of the state? What do we say about the Democratic Party? I mean, I don't think it's a positive thing that all these people who are involved in Occupy are now the heart of the Sanders campaign and talking about building a left wing of the Democratic Party. I think that reflects a weakness for our side. The Chicago Teachers Union, you know what I mean? They went on strike, inspired the country, and then they shut down all these schools. And there's no shortcut around rebuilding those forces. Like, there is no... It's not like Sanders is just going to create that force. And if only we took a different, if only our 700 members and your 400 members got together and formed a left wing of the Democratic Party. Tell me if I'm getting the numbers wrong. Say it's 1,000. You know what I mean? But even if we got all those people together and said, we're going to be the left wing of the Sanders campaign, and out of that we're going to have a 10,000 person independent party, that's not what's in store. It's not what Bernie has in mind. It's not what the prospects for. It will run into the same challenges every movement in the last 7 years has run into. We need a process of political maturation of our side. We need a process of organization. We need to have strategies that can overcome the challenges that they're putting out to us. And I think the search for shortcuts, time and time again, the search for shortcuts has actually set the left back rather than taking the left forward. And I think compromising on this question of the Democratic Party in a year in which people are more disgusted with the Democratic Party than ever, and yet we're facing the possibility of Donald Trump as the Republican candidate and a lesser evil election like we haven't seen. And I don't remember the last time we saw an election that's going to be like the upcoming election and where our side is going to be viciously attacked. I mean, to be honest, like you, me, we're going to be on the same side of being viciously attacked for being the people bringing back fascism in the United States. And like, if we've supported the Democratic Party, even half-heartedly, even critically, even saying that we can support someone within it, we've tied one hand behind our back in that process of building an alternative. And there's a quote that Danny Ketch is sitting right there, wrote in Socialist Worker a year ago, and Facebook Memories pulled it up for me this morning. And I think it's still relevant. I'm going to end with this. It says, "We have to do the hard work now of building independent political forces in preparation for whatever opportunities arise. Radicals hoping to use the Sanders campaign to assemble those forces for them are generals in search of an army who hope that the Democratic Party will be careless enough to leave one unattended. It just isn't going to happen. There are no shortcuts. We need to begin the process of rebuilding a left that can build on the anger that exists out there, recognize that, but actually chart a way forward."
Thanks to Jen and Philip for their contributions. So before we pass it back to sum up, we've got exactly 45 minutes for discussion. I'm going to try and keep the discussion balanced from different trends on the left. And if comrades can keep it to 2 to 3 minutes, 2.5 minutes is where I'm going to give one of those, then that would be excellent. And I've got Algier first.
Algier Hawks, Socialist Alternative. I don't know if everybody saw the Daily News yesterday. A piece written by Sean King. He said, "Here's why I'm leaving the Democratic Party." And in that piece, he chronicles actually his time inside the Bill Clinton campaign in the early 90s and mid-90s to this very moment right now where he's decided that he will break from the Democratic Party. And we've heard the same language from Michelle Alexander, actually, in her stunning piece in The Nation magazine, why Hillary doesn't deserve the black vote. I think what we're seeing, particularly with the DNC's attack on Sanders, that this is not just the simple fact that he's an anti-corporate campaign inside of a pro-capitalist party, but it's also, at its core, an ideological problem for the Democratic Party and what it has and what it will unleash down the road as these developments continue to take root. I think for many people, they're living through a lived experience, a struggle actually. Sometimes it's a delayed reaction with things. Some people would say, why did people vote for Obama when they got betrayed in 2008? Occupy happens in 2011. Sanders is kind of the representative of that Occupy moment in many ways. And I think what we are having right now, and what I think we will see as this debate continues to go on, is that the Sanders campaign is just the beginning stage of a different political paradigm that's going to open up in U.S. politics. Trump has done it in another way, but Sanders has done it in this particular way. If we can remember historically the birth of the Labour Party in Britain, in some ways, Keir Hardie, who was a leading miner, thought that he could go inside the Liberal Party and reform the Liberal Party, and he was crushed inside that formation, the formation of the bosses. In many ways, it's not the question of what Sanders would do, but in fact his supporters and what they will do and what they learn from this experience. Now, our role, and I'm gonna stop on this, as grassroots socialists in many ways, is to have that dialogue with those folks who are learning these hard lessons, the way Sean King had to learn in many ways. We're looking at a radical minority, and there are tens of thousands of that radical minority that may draw the conclusion that I've had enough. I've seen Nevada. I've seen the purge in Brooklyn of the voters. I've seen what has happened in Arizona in the voting polls. So in many ways, I think as we go forward, the question, and I want to correct you, because I was at the Movement for Bernie rallies, that there were no signs for vote for Bernie. That might have been independent folks, Bernie supporters, but our signs talked about a party of the 99%, a party to take the working class in a new direction, like Shama Sawant did in Seattle. And we want 1,000 Shamas to blossom around the country, but also we want to say, look at the national example of Sanders and what he has done in that campaign in many ways. And let's say that it is possible to build a new formation and build the movements which is not diametrically opposed from one another. Organically, the question is always posed in any social movement, who will represent the working class and poor? in city council, in city hall, in the governor's office, and that's another battleground for us.
David, I didn't call on you at all in the last meeting, so I guess I have to now.
But you do have to. 1,000 Kashamas, that sounds wonderful. I'm David from the Socialist Party in Boston. I should mention we have our own, we've decided what to do. We're running our own slate, Soltisig and Walker. I'm tempted to say that I agree with the critiques, the well thought out critiques, mutual between ISO and SALT, and I suspect you'd have legitimate critiques of the SP's view, and I'm not so concerned about these critiques, although we need them. But for this meeting, what's on my mind is what can we do? And what do we have in common? Because I see that these two organizations that are very well organized have noticed that we have to orient to the Sanders supporters, that this is a total change in U.S. politics, that changes our politics, that changes what we do. In a way, these two groups are leading us, in my opinion. Kshama's first victory, the first among many, right, showed the nation, including Sanders, right, that you could run as a socialist and win. The Sanders campaign shows us that thousands of us can run as socialists all around the country and in national campaigns and win all over the place. If we have a party, if we have an organization that can lead us to winning, and that's the difficulty. We don't even have a tiny party of 10 or 20,000. What we have are minuscule fragments that are having difficulty just talking together sometimes, and maybe sometimes not having so much difficulty. And so what is on my mind is, for example, Chama's proposal earlier today for a conference where they have to decide what to do next. On my mind is what can we do right here in New York City this weekend, some of us, to talk about these next steps. How can we resolve the division of the left? And I'll just mention that we have proof of the possibility of this in Boston. A conference was held 3 weeks ago of the Boston Socialist Unity Project, initiated by CCDS a couple of years ago, Committees of Correspondence. Duncan may want to talk about it. The Communist Party was involved, and virtually the entire left was involved, and there will be another conference. Work is already underway, and I believe this is possible everywhere in the U.S.
Can I speak?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I actually have a question for Philip. So you're talking about how you all call for the independence from the Democratic Party, but I would like to ask you a question about your safe states approach, because I feel like that's a capitulation to the Democratic Party. So I would just like to hear him speak about that.
Right, and the comments can address it towards the end.
I want to remind people about 1972. I was in SDS. I was a Trotskyist in SDS in 1972 at the University of Georgia. Very isolated, but I'll tell you something. There were ferocious arguments that year about supporting George McGovern. Tremendous arguments. That destroyed SDS. The people who said it's a tactic, we're going to work a little bit with the George McGovern campaign. By 1975, there were no campus radicals. Read Chris Lash's Culture of Narcissism, but also go back and see the same kind of cowardly arguments that say you can somehow swim in the same sewer with a Democratic Party politician, and Bernie Sanders has got right-wing foreign policy positions. The people who can swim in the same sewer with these rats, they are leading a large portion of potentially independent leftists to the idea of, well, let's have a little bit of lesser evilism, but we'll have tactics so we can work with that. I grew up in segregationist Georgia. I've hated the Democratic Party since I was about 10 years old. They're the party of slavery, the Confederacy, they're the party of racism, they're the party of segregation. Stop this stuff. Let's have a national conversation of the entire far left. Let's build some kind of working class party, and let's destroy the Democratic Party.
My name is Teresa Gutierrez. I actually want to speak first as a Mexicana, and I'll talk a little bit about my political background. But I just think it's important, as we have socialists talking about the movements, that it took about 30 minutes before y'all raised anything on the immigration question until, the sister here raised it. And it's important to say that because, 2.5 million people have been deported by the Democratic Party. And the opening shot of the recent period of movements wasn't Occupy, it was the immigration struggles of 2006, where millions of people took to the streets, not just once, but several times. And the immigrant movement did revive May Day, and I'm sure all of y'all go to May Day demonstrations, and we do have the immigration movement to thank for that. So I wanted to just, as leftists. I'm also a member of Workers' Party. I know most of y'all think that we're Stalinists. I have no idea why, but we're not. And I've had my issues with, the ISO and SA, and most of it has been around the international questions because of positions on Cuba and so forth. And so it's hard for me to even take the floor, but I'm actually quite moved by this discussion. And I think that our party is running 2 black folks for president and vice president. And I'm not raising it to push it because, I want to push my party. I'm raising it because I think the issue of national oppression and racism is key to the left in this country. And I would even argue that it's decisive. And I didn't join other parties back in the day because, they didn't take that issue seriously. And I don't want to lecture here about the importance of that. That's not what I think is our position right now or our point. But when Hillary Clinton, when I heard the news that she had brought onto the campaign the mother of Trayvon Martin, I was like stunned, and it showed how far the movement from below has pushed these elements, because 5 years ago, Hillary Clinton would never have brought on, Trayvon Martin's mother. And and I thought, well, of course she brought on Trayvon's mother because Trayvon wasn't killed by a cop. And that was a little bit safer for her. But then she brought on Sandra Bland's mother, so that shut me up, right? But it did show, the power of what's happening below. So I actually think that, the issue of in or out with Bernie is a very interesting discussion. But I do think that the left should unite in this period to mobilize for the Republican and Democratic national conventions as one force. I do think that that's a point of unity. And our party, and I'll wrap up, but I'm the first person of color to speak, so I want a little extra minute. I'm sorry.
And Nikita.
No, that's not
Okay. I'm sorry. I apologize. But anyway, I think that there are points of unity that we can do here, and we want to throw our hat into that ring to struggle for that unity. And I do think that the international questions are pivotal for the left to understand.
Thanks, Teresa. This guy,
Teresa.
Teresa.
Oh, don't worry about it.
I didn't call on him in the other panel I chaired, so I feel obligated to.
Being the first white person to speak. You talk about going into the sewer and not getting involved with rats. Well, I'm not a plumber, but when I snake out my toilet, I got to get my hands dirty. And here's what Bernie's done for us. He's allowed a guy like me, who wasn't a Democrat, to actually get in there, get into that sewer a little bit, and find that I could actually talk to those people. They have to listen to me because they're Bernie people. I'm a Bernie person, but they're kind of a liberal Democrat Bernie person, and I'm coming from a very different perspective, probably more akin to yours. But Bernie provided us a chance to do was sheepdog for our concerns. We're always concerned about Bernie sheepdogging for the Democratic Party, but that's a two-sided coin. That's on that issue. But just one other thing is that I want to bring up is that this third Bernie panel I've been to here, I think, and no one's talked about the upcoming convention, and this might be a little bit off kilter, but off the point. But my question is this: how trying to get a feel for how people think about civil disobedience at the convention? Yes or no? Occupy the convention? Yes or no? And I was hoping that at the Left Forum there would be some talk about that. And while looking through the program, I didn't see anything specifically addressed to that. So it's just something I'd be curious to hear people respond to.
Okay, we haven't had someone from the ISO speak in the discussion yet, so we're gonna do that now.
Well, I wasn't planning to chime in on all the issues that have been raised. I stepped out for a number of them, but I did want to respond to the question about the DNC. We anticipate that there will be like a number of disappointed, Bernie supporters, and we're organizing a socialist convergence to take place. I'm just going to pass him to his mom here. Okay, so there's going to be a socialist convergence happening in downtown Philadelphia during the convention. It'll be in the evenings, and Socialist Alternative is one of the co-sponsoring organizations, and the co-sponsors and the meetings and so forth are still in formation, but I know you and many other left groups are participating. So that'll be a space for us to have sort of after the street protests and so forth, discussions like this one about like the way forward. So I encourage you to look. I think we have flyers at the ISO table. You can get the link to the Facebook page, and please do everyone come to Philadelphia, July 25th through 28th, and take part in the socialist convergence as well as all the demonstrations that are being called.
Okay, I've got Linda now.
Okay, Linda Thompson from the Left Elect Coalition. There is a coalition of all the leftist groups that met in Chicago in May. And it was so positive. It was a dialogue. There were people there from Sanders. There was Peace and Freedom. There was Green Party. There was the different socialist organizations. And it was a comradely discussion, much like what's going on here. But the commitment was to build a coalition and an independent force left of the Democratic Party that can start running in the elections. And I think the left is paying dearly for not paying attention to the electoral arena over the last 40 years. Actually, the Green Party existed for over 20 years now, but a lot of the socialist organizations and left per se have not only not supported the Green Party, but a lot of them, including the inside-outside people, were attacking it. And this is really crazy. The other thing is we've got about 6 different little groups running presidential campaigns. We've got to stop doing that. Everybody has a right to run. That's very fine, but we should be uniting between one powerful campaign so that we can actually look like a player. Right now, we're not players in the electoral arena. So that's the purpose of the Left Elect Coalition. But I think on the Sanders campaign, the point I want to make is that if you're in there, you can't say what needs to be said. You can't talk about the foreign policy. You can't talk about the undemocratic election procedures like ballot access, proportional representation, IRB, all these things that Hillary and Bernie aren't for whatsoever. This is the key thing. We need the left to start focusing on getting democratic elections so we can participate. Open up the presidential debates. Support the suit that the Green Party and the Libertarians have. This is the way we make it real. Left Elect is going to have a conference in 2017, probably early. It's something to look forward to. We should all be sponsoring it, building it, and getting people there, particularly out of the Sanders campaign. I don't buy that you have to be in there with them to talk to them. You don't.
I've had my hand up in the beginning. So
That's fine, a lot of people have it. You'll get called on next after Alan.
I want to say that, well, I'm from Socialist Alternative. My name is Alan. One of the problems that we have is this, is that when the socialist left is so small and insignificant, unfortunately, in the current period, we don't get to choose where the fight is actually taking place. Actually, this condition is objectively imposed upon us because of the collapse of the left from the 70s and from the 80s. And it's also the collapse of the union left, of the collapse of historically speaking. And therefore, it has created the current conditions where we have these upsurge, and I think it is correct to call it historic. I mean, this upsurge of socialist ideas being discussed in the mainstream of American politics. And we don't get to choose where actually that is taking place. We have, in our view, we do not agree with the view of DSA that sort of just hurrah along the whatever it's taking place inside the Democratic Party. But we do not agree also with the view that we can sit from the sidelines and just preach about the bad character of the Democratic Party. That we need to find concrete, clear strategies that could actually cut across and clarify the issues, repopularize the need for independent working class politics, repopularize the ideas of real socialism, the ideas of solidarity and struggle and so on. And there's no contradiction. There's no actually historical sequence that predicates that first you have to have social movements in order to have political formations emerge from the left. Actually, it has happened several times. It happens the other way around. Actually, political formations can anticipate the rise of political movements and vice versa. Of course, you can have social movements as well as we continue to have. Now, the exciting fact out of all this is that the young generation, a new generation is being radicalized and is coming into politics. These are not historical Democratic Party voters. These are not the typical, actually you see this contradiction coming up all the time in the polls, where among all the independents, he gets a majority, and it's among the Democratic Party voters, the historical party voters, that he doesn't get, I mean, he gets resonates, but he doesn't get the same majority. This is a new phenomenon, and the socialist left, because we're small and insignificant, because we cannot get, like Debs did, 6%, 5%, we cannot get this kind of vote. We do not have that option. If we had that option, we would take these tactics. We would run those. But because we don't have that option, we have to actually try to develop this idea and find slogans, find ways to popularize the idea of independent politics, and to try also to lay the foundation, if you like, to prepare the way so that we can actually lead a section of the people towards independent politics and so on. The Socialist Alternative, for those who claim that we actually went into the Sanders campaign with a clear, as Philip explained, with a clear perspective, but also we're doing that with a street cred, if you like, of having run an independent socialist candidate, won twice in Seattle, and therefore we can credibly argue that we can say that there is a viable way that we can actually run independent working class politics and lay the base once again for socialist ideas in the US.
Yes.
Sanders has an impeccable record as a loyal cog in the Democratic Party machine, supporting bloody American imperialism to the hilt. Just for example, in 2014, he endorsed the Israeli massacre of Palestinians in Gaza and most recently vowed to continue Obama's drone strikes. It's absolutely clear that he is a capitalist politician on the other side of the class line from the workers' movement. Sanders uses populist rhetoric to corral disillusioned voters back into the lesser evil party of the American ruling class. Instead of opposing this, both SALT and the ISO are in fact faithfully serving Bernie, yet again doing donkey work for the Democrats. His, quote, political revolution is a lie, but you reformists totally buy into it, and now you're helping Bernie sell it. You want to transform the so-called Bernie movement into another fight the right pressure campaign to reform the capitalist rulers, as if a wing of the ruling class is an ally for historic progress. Your debate is actually a farce because you both push illusions in bourgeois democracy, which is a screen for the brutal class exploitation inherent in capitalism. You both push illusions in incremental reforms of the capitalist state, which is fundamentally unreformable. And while you both talk about independence, for Marxists, independence is a class question. And you both support capitalist politicians year after year, the ISO no less. You guys openly support the Green Party, which is a capitalist party, just like Democrats and Republicans. And the trade union bureaucrat you support in the Chicago Teachers Union, Jesse Sharkey, in turn supports the Democrats. And SALT is already finding a way to give backhanded support to Hillary in the swing states. Neither of your organizations is capable of breaking the working class from the Democrats because neither organization takes on the fundamental obstacle to working class struggle.
3 minutes.
The pro-capitalist trade union bureaucracy, which chains the workers and the oppressed to a party of the class enemy. We revolutionary Marxists of the Spartacist League fight for a class struggle leadership of the workers' movement, which is essential to building a workers' party that fights for social revolution. And only an internationalist revolutionary workers' party can smash the capitalist state, expropriate the bourgeoisie's property, and open the road to socialism. And that is what you guys should try to debate.
So next up I have Jeff, then Joanna, then myself, then Danny, and then Pat.
I was gonna say how it was refreshing to be in this debate that didn't sound like the caricatures of the left. But I won't start with that. I don't think that what's at stake in this debate is relating to the Sanders audience. We may not agree on whether you have to be in the campaign or not to effectively do that, but I agree with Jen that it hasn't been our experience that not endorsing the campaign has cut us off from influencing either rank and file members of the campaign who we work alongside with, or many of the people who've spoken out against the Democratic Party that the comrade behind me mentioned. We've been able to do that from outside the campaign. I do think what's at stake is the larger question of the relationship that the revolutionary left has to the broader left. And I'm not sure that the Labour Party the formation of the Labour Party is the best example to draw from. And we could debate the structure of the Labour Party in British politics and all that, but there's much more, there are other examples closer to home. Jesse Jackson, George McGovern, the American Labor Party. There's a long history in which the Democratic Party has mobilized a left wing to shore up its support in the left, and an Achilles heel of the broader left in this country has been the argument that every 4 years, this isn't the right time to fight for independent politics. Even the Green Party, it sabotaged the Green Party after Nader's run, that we can't do it. We have to do some safe state strategy, working families party. There's always some excuse for whether it's in the trade unions or in the broader left about why this is not the time for us to push an independent platform, an independent political alternative. And if the people, and we should be clear that the moment when the left is going to be best positioned to push an independent political alternative will be also the moment where the Democrats put forward the most viable left-wing alternative to shut that down. And if the revolutionary left, which has a principled position against supporting capitalist parties, abdicates on that question, it, as Jen said, I think it ties us in the long run with one hand behind our back. Now, I agree 100% with Philip about the idea that struggles in the period currently and in the period ahead are going to be messy. They're going to be led by class forces and politics that are not ours, and in which socialists are going to be a minority but have to find a way to relate to those audiences and have influence in them. I think the other challenge in that is how do we do that while holding on to fundamental principles of our tradition? The relationship of revolutionaries to the state that has come up in Europe with questions like Syria. How do you have influence in struggles where the question of state power is a real one while still maintaining influence in those? Or here, how do we maintain a principled opposition to the Democratic Party and against endorsing the Democratic Party while still having influence and being able to relate to people who are being radicalized by it? And that to me is the bigger point of difference.
Hi, my name is Joanne Landy, and I'm an independent socialist. I'm not in either the Socialist Alternative or ISO, although I do agree with the ISO in the point of view that they've expressed here.
Louder, Joanne.
Okay. Did you hear any of it?
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're all focused on the question of what next, and I'm, a little disappointed when I hear that what you're thinking of doing in Philadelphia is a socialist convergence, because I think that leaves out of the picture all of the people that you've been describing, that is, people who are not hostile to socialism, but whose basic self-identification isn't yet socialist, but who are Bernie or bust, or people who are who can't swallow the idea of voting for Hillary. And so I'm wondering if there's a way to propose something. I know that at the Left Elect Conference, we talked about that. That was one formation. It may not be the best way to do it, but I think something broader would be better.
I've got myself, Danny, and Pat actually in that coalition. That's what we argued for, and we lost the vote. So there was the question that Jen posed at the beginning about why are we calling on Bernie Sanders to run as an independent if he said over and over again he's not going to do it, right? You could say, well, pressure's been put on him by Black Lives Matter, by the 15 movement, and he's changed. But we don't expect him to change this position, right? But it's a question of how do you work with other forces and expose those other forces. Right. It's by putting forward positive proposals that can gain an echo with his base that he's not willing to do, right? It's the same thing in terms of Wisconsin. Did we think the union leaders were going to organize a general strike? Fuck no, we didn't. Did we call for a general strike? Yes. Hell yes, we did, right? And it was because that was a popular demand that exposed the misleadership, and Bernie Sanders is a misleader at this stage. And I think it's important for us to have an overall understanding of the period we're in. It's a period of extremely explosive struggle, but starting from a very low level of organization, a low level of consciousness. And this means that there are going to be huge twists and turns. Syriza seeming to be the leading force against austerity one day, literally one day, and the next day implementing austerity. This means that socialists are going to need extremely flexible tactics because of this contradiction. I think also as well when Jen presents that Sanders has been a cover for Clinton the whole time, right? I think we need to look at it less static and more of a process. People who joined the Bernie Sanders campaign at the beginning, probably the vast majority of them thought, he's better than Hillary Clinton and that's why I'm joining, but I guess she's okay too. Through the process of struggle, through the process of political struggle and debate, they changed that view, right? And I think that it's important for us to look at the Sanders campaign as a process that's affected consciousness and think about the best way to intervene. I think that the ISO has been better than, say, the Spartacus League and how to relate to the Sanders campaign. I couldn't find the right way to say it. But at Washington Square Park, right, at the big Sanders rally, the ISO did relate to the Sanders supporters and were probably very friendly. Their main slogan was "Join the Socialists," right?
No one is the sorry.
No, and to build their own organization. We're trying to build our own organization as well, but also we put forward the next step for the movement in terms of something that will expose Sanders, calling on him to run as an independent. And I think there are questions of method. We don't pretend that we don't have questions of method about Trotsky's transitional program, etc. And I think that those questions of method are reflected in the fact that we do call for a broader party of the 99%, whereas ISO focuses on slogans like "Join the Socialists" and getting organized around the Socialists. So I will. Hopefully, someone kept time for me and I didn't go too long there. I've got Danny. Catch.
What? Great that I get to respond to that, because I guess I would disagree with the characterization that when the ISO, which is engaged in the Green Party and trying to build collaborative with other groups on the left through the Green Party, that we are the ones who counterpose building our own organization, whereas SALT has generally just put forward SALT candidates as opposed to broader, and there's various reasons for that, but let's just, there's various ways of looking at what it means to be just putting forward your own organization. I also think it's a little bit cynical in a room of just the left to call Sanders a misleader and then in public to be saying that Sanders is the way forward. And I think that's not really a healthy dynamic. You know what I mean? And I think that's a little bit what's behind when Jen is saying that throughout you have to, I don't think it's static at all. I think it's dialectical. You understand that there's both a process by which Sanders is expressing a massive amount of discontent with the system and acting as reinvigorating the left wing of the Democratic Party, and that at different moments in the campaign, one is going to be more to the fore than others. I also think I've heard a couple times folks throw out a couple things. The formulation that the left is so small and that we just have to, we don't get to choose our opportunities. Well, first of all, no matter how big we are, we're never going to get to choose the opportunities that are presented for us. We don't get, but I understand that's another point. I would also argue that, true, as small as the left is, we shouldn't underestimate the hard work it's taken for all the various organizations to build themselves to the point that they've gotten to develop cadre, and the dangers of actually losing a lot of that in relation to the Democratic Party. It's a real question. Beyond that, it seems to me, my comrade Alan from Queens, like myself, you also don't get to choose who Bernie Sanders actually is, which it seems to me is part of what we don't get to choose. That the fact that the person who's articulating this discontent has a long and loyal track record with the Democratic Party, even though he's been an independent. And so to put forward an idea that again, the publicly saying we can get Bernie to change his mind while privately saying we all know Bernie's not going to change his mind. I don't think that's a healthy way to actually build self-activity and collaboration on the left. And I just want to wrap up by asking a couple questions for Philip then, just to more specifics about the points you brought up. One, specifically, what impact do you think you're having on the left Democrats? And secondly, when you talked before about we would put, in the campaign, we would put this, out there about forming a new party, and lots of people were interested, lots of people signed up for that. What does signed up for that mean?
I have Pat, the gentleman in the red shirt, who's had to stand up from the start. Pat.
I mean, I think we all agree that there's a historic crisis of capitalism, and the task facing us is as rapidly as possible, building a force in society. As rapidly as possible, sorry, Alan, rapidly as possible, building a force in society that can be a tool to bring millions of people into activity to fight this system. But I think what is at stake in this debate is, I do think it is a question of how we relate to these people in our society who are beginning to draw conclusions under the impact of events, beginning to draw conclusions about the political system, the political parties, etc. How do we relate to them as best as, and how do we be as effective as we can in pulling them along with us, even as a small force? I think that is the question. And now, when ISO members are talking about it didn't cut us off from the Sanders campaign, what I hear is it didn't cut us off from in one-on-one discussions. At protests, we were able to talk to people. At paper sales, our co-workers, we were able to talk to people. We were able to have public meetings. I'm sure you can get. And there's no doubt that socialists who take their position can recruit out of the Sanders campaign, get a certain audience. But when we're talking about relating to the Sanders campaign through the tactic that we're advocating and that we advocate, we're talking about 30,000 signatures. We're talking about Shama Sawant speaking to 15,000 people in the Mariners baseball stadium. We're talking about leading marches around the country of thousands of people. We're talking about getting on RT News and participating in this debate that millions of people are talking about right now about Bernie Sanders. Should he run as an independent? Should he endorse Clinton? That's the role that socialists have the potential to play in these events, in this process. And that's, I think, what really is at stake right now. Socialists can play a much bigger role than ever before. It's a new period. And I'm not saying that we have to give up our program. I'm not saying that we have to give up our principles. We have to wage an active campaign to fight for our program. That is the real principle. As effectively as you can, we want to fight for our program of socialism, of a new party. And I would just say this idea of how we build the left is not a linear process. We're seeing Sean King is starting to, under the impact of events, people begin to draw conclusions. And if we position ourselves correctly with our, on the basis of our independent organization, our own program, but with flexible tactics, we can begin to pull other forces with us. And I think that's what this debate's really about.
With the gentleman in the red shirt and then Lee, and then we'll have one more speaker for the guy in the suit before the sun.
So I'm an independent lefty. I'm not in any of these organizations and never have been. And I, just put that out there. I think what's clear about all this shit is that Bernie is not of the left. I think people are still confused about that because he says socialist. They think he's like one of us. As I explained to my 5-year-old, we like Bernie, but we love Che. Right? That's how it goes in my house. And I think that when you look at it that way, when you look at it in that way, it makes sense that he didn't run as an independent and that he went with the DNC, right? Because he would be getting just as much publicity as Jill Stein right now for the rest of the country. He gets to debate Hillary Clinton on everybody's TV as many times as he can fight for it, and that has changed the national conversation on a minimum wage and a whole bunch of shit. So it's strategically smart for him to do that. We may not like it, I didn't like it, but that's why he did it. And it reflects the weakness of the revolutionary left. And I want to talk about the limitations of the left, because I'm a red diaper baby and I've been stuck with you all for the last 37 years. We have high turnover. We are more concerned about being right, about having the correct party line, and we don't really talk about taking state power, right? We talk about it abstractly, but we don't actually talk about getting state power, which makes no sense, because in the last several years, the two examples of people who actually took state power, Kshama Sawant, a city council member, and Lumumba, the mayor in Mississippi, we treated them like Che had arrived again. It's like I mean, she's great, she's a city council member. Massive excitement throughout the left. Let's be honest about that. And it wasn't this. It forced discipline. It forced us to ask questions about taking state power. We didn't just get stuck having debates about 1917 and the Spanish Civil War. And I think that I'll leave on just two notes, right? One is that there is a proto moment going on here. You saw it in Wisconsin. You saw it in Bloombergville when they slept outside of Bloomberg's thing. You saw it in Occupy Wall Street. You can see it all over the globe, but it's happening. You can see it in Black Lives Matter. There is something coming. And the difference between these examples from 1970, between, frankly, even the Jackson campaign of 84 and 88, I worked on them as a child. The difference in that is that we didn't have the fucking internet. We didn't have social media. And this idea that everybody's, they're gonna get texts from Hillary Clinton, which means that they're just gonna be drinking the Kool-Aid. My Facebook don't say that. My Facebook is a bunch of people who are like fucking pissed as shit at Hillary and the rest of the Democrats. So I'll leave it at this. I heard you hit the desk. We need to honestly address the limitations of the left. We really need to deal with that. It is not about Sanders. It is about us. That's the first thing. And the second thing is time is of the essence. We need to get ready. It is coming. We can't just fucking debate 1917 forever. That's all I have to say.
Okay, so, well, I guess I would disagree with you, Sam, that some of those historical debates don't actually carry some currency, but I won't go all the way back to 1917 per se. We can talk about that another time. But I do think that there's a particular, and probably a lot of people in this room would agree with this, that there is a resonance as an historical pattern about the way that the Democratic Party has been able to be a pull on the leftward forces within particular movements. I actually did work on the Jesse Jackson campaign as a college student, so it's a little, yes, I'm that old. And I think, and I guess I want to go back to what the comrade at the front said about that we're starting from a low level, and I think that there was an implication there that muddying our politics and the sort of political clarity, because we're at a low level, that gives us a certain latitude or an opening for that. And I guess I would disagree with that, because I think actually when you are at a particular, at this point in time, it's all the more important to have political clarity, because the stakes need to be clarified, because the where we go forward from here becomes that much more important. I mean, I joined the ISO just a few short years, I guess you could say, after the Jesse Jackson campaign. I would say that experience of having gone through that, and it was not an accident that I joined a group that I felt like had a particular political clarity and principle about the political nature of it. I don't think it's about holding these up as sort of abstract, what do they call them, stones or whatever they're called, but I think the historical record is such, and Jeff spoke to this earlier, but people should, Kianga Yamada Taylor's new book, From Black Liberation to, for Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, really goes through the history of I think the problematic role that those movements have had, and I think, therefore, it concerns me the kind of ambiguity that I think comes out of a sort of slightly complicated or complex and contradictory relationship to the Sanders campaign. I mean, I have I think that it's not, certainly, you could, the comrade back here said, well, there's been openness or what have you on individual conversations, individual meetings, and so on, but where the meetings with 20,000, 30,000, I think actually, I don't fetishize a conversation with 3 people versus a conversation with 30,000, but I would say, and right now we're actively involved, for example, in the Verizon Solidarity campaign, in which some of those leading members are actually came out of the political committee, are active Bernie supporters, but the political honesty and the directness that is happening with those at a time where I would like to argue that I think that strike has enormous stakes for the way forward for the labor movement. I think actually there's a qualitative weight to that particular direction and so on that is extremely important. I also think that, and I agree with Jeff that I don't think it's necessarily just about a particular openness or friendliness, but I do think that having those political arguments and being clear about that also lays the basis for a widening influence of genuinely independent politics. And I actually think that, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't realize there was a wrap-up sign up there. I'll just end there. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Lee. And then gentleman in the denim shirt just had his hand up literally the whole time.
Not quite, but almost. Yeah, I think the phrase for Bernie Sanders, sheepdog, is perfectly appropriate. He rounds up the strays who have been straying from the Democratic Party, and he brings them back into the fold, what Kucinich used to call the big tent. And Kucinich was far more left-wing in many ways than Bernie was. Because, I have a phrase, foreign policy matters. I mean, we have to tell people, look, this guy called Chavez a dead communist dictator, and he was quite frank about it. And this is what you're telling people this is what you're saying to people in the Democratic Party, that this is, we understand why you think that Chavez is a dead communist dictator. The thing is that we've been through 8 years of Obama. I remember the ISO was quite euphoric at the time of the Obama election, expecting great victories to be won and massive movements to be brought about. That didn't happen, and people were very, very disappointed and discouraged. And then you had Occupy, and you had some upheavals, and people are looking desperately for the Democratic Party to rescue them. They're looking for some escape, and it's the wrong thing to say that we're going to get into the primaries, tell you not to vote for Obama. For Hillary. And then we'll even tell you that in safe states are the only possible possibility. Look, safe states mean you're not serious about destroying the Democratic Party. That's what that means. I remember when I was in the Green Party meeting, and Cobb from the Green Party was advocating this. And that's what I was saying at the time. And that's the Green Party, which doesn't even call itself socialist. And here we have socialists saying, I'm not serious about defeating the Democratic Party. I think that's horrible.
Thank you. So now we're going to pass it to the sum-ups with Jen and then Phil. Sorry everyone didn't get a chance to speak, but that's just the nature of the thing.
Okay. There's so much to respond to in this discussion, and I feel like the debate got sharper and sharper as it went along. I may continue in that vein. I want to say something about Washington Square Park, because I think the idea of comparing different socialist groups' strategy based on like a table that you saw at Washington Square Park is not a very good method for starting out evaluating different left strategies. First of all, we had 6 tables at Washington Square Park. We had a banner that said no one is illegal in 3 languages. We had multiple signs around a bunch of different things. We had sign-up sheets to bring people down to the Verizon picket lines because Verizon workers went on strike just as that rally was happening, and we were engaged in lots of discussions around a whole range of issues, as I'm sure were you. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure we both had a whole number of discussions, so I just don't think it's a really good way of going about it. And it's not the ISO's method, nor has it ever been the ISO's method, to privilege join the socialists just as its own thing over other kinds of struggles. We actually, both Socialist Alternative and the ISO are quite clear about our desire to build our organizations, and I think the socialist left should build itself. I think that's an important thing, and I think both organizations will probably come out of the Sanders campaign larger, and that will be a positive accomplishment of this campaign. We have different strategies for how to engage in broader sort of struggles, and I think a different level of primacy on the question of electoral efforts, and I'm going to come back to that. I do want to say, so I will say, maybe Philip, you can clarify. I'm a little confused about Socialist Alternative's position on Sanders at this point, because Elgira, you said we weren't telling people to vote for Sanders, but I saw SALT members with their Sanders volunteer shirts, going around. And, someone said, you said Bernie Sanders is a misleader at this point. But I just kind of want clarity on if you're calling for a vote for Sanders, because I don't know what it means to be in the campaign if you're not calling for a vote for Sanders. It seems like you are, but I just want to sort of get clarity on that question. I think in terms of the messy process question and half measures and the British Labour Party and all that kind of stuff, I think there's a fundamentally different estimation of what's going on at the level of ruling class politics right now that we have, because I think a lot of people on the left have concluded from a kind of messy, bruising, primary campaign that the Democratic Party is coming apart at the seams, that the two-party system is cracking open at the center, and I don't see that. I see a lot of people who are really angry about the Democratic Party, for sure, no doubt about it, and we're relating to those people, and I think there's an opening that exists there. Their self-confidence and consciousness to act independently on that hatred and organize independently, I think, is another question, but I don't think at the level of institutional politics, the Democratic Party is coming apart at the seams. There was just a article today about how, as Sanders is on the stump speech campaign, attacking Hillary and all this kind of stuff, also calling key Democratic Senate leaders and Democratic Party leaders and quietly assuring them that he's going to be there for building unity after the general election. I actually think in a lot of ways the Democratic Party is going to come out of this campaign stronger. Partially because they are going to absorb a layer of people who are going to focus on building left-wing Democratic campaigns, building the kind of de Blasio campaigns, the Elizabeth Warren campaigns, and all of the rest of that. And I think they're quite confident, actually, about their position. I think Hillary's pissed, you know what I mean? And I think she's the type of person who gets a little pissed. But I think that overall, what they've done is managed to pull people back in. Someone said, I think it was Alan, that these aren't traditional Democratic voters who are voting for Sanders. I would agree with that. That's precisely the value of the Sanders campaign to the Democratic Party, is you're taking non-traditional Democratic voters and you're giving them a reason to hope again. And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying to people, I understand your desire to hope, but the path does not lie that way. The path lies this way, and having a very consistent and clear approach on it. On the question of building, what do we build out of it, and the responsibility of the left to build something, I guess I would say I don't see much difference between the question of how Jill Stein has approached the Sanders campaign, other than the fact that she's standing outside it, and how SALT has in terms of putting forward an argument, a patient argument to people that if Sanders loses, here's the independent campaign. You know what I mean? Okay. So I think you can make an argument for independent politics. I would love to do that. I would love for the ISO and Socialist Alternative and DSA, I don't think that's going to happen, but if DSA and the Green Party all had decided a year ago, you know what I mean, we're going to spend this campaign patiently relating to people, signing people up, arguing with people about independent politics, that would be great. I think the problem is that you compromise yourself by doing that from within the Democratic Party. I've made that point a number of times. I think the question of electoralism is a big one. We're for a mass party of the 99%. Someone said that's a big difference between the ISO and SALT. We are totally for a mass party of the 99%. I'm not sure who on the left is not for a mass party of the 99%. I think the question is how to get there, and is it the central question for the left towards which all others bend. And in a discussion a couple of years ago, Al and I spoke together right after Sawant's election with Bhaskar from Jacobin. And I remember it made a big impression on me. Alan, you said something like how, you had Occupy, you had all these different things, and the sort of road of struggle was blocked. And then there's this electoral road, and you can look at Swan, you can say that's the arena where the discontent can show itself and where there's an opening for our side. I would argue that the electoral road faces the same, not blocks, but challenges that we have to overcome. Because after Sawant was elected, like someone said, we want 1,000 Sawants. Well, after Swan was elected, she talked about 100 Occupy candidates. What happened to those 100 Occupy candidates? I'm not blaming Sawant or Socialist Alternative for not building 100 Occupy candidates. I think the reality is that it was much more difficult than we expected. I actually think a lot of the left poured itself into trying to build independent campaigns. In New York City, we worked together on the Hawkins-Jones campaign with the Green Party. We got 5% of the vote. It was modest, but we were up against Zephyr Teachout and the Working Families Party, and like what Danny said about like the left wing of the Democratic Party in Chicago. So that was a positive but modest experience. In Chicago, the experience was much more difficult, if not damaging, in terms of a progressive Democrat like Chuy Garcia sucking the energy out of the left, and in the wake of the Sawant campaign, people being like, maybe this, or maybe this independent campaign that the Chicago Teachers Union can pursue. When in reality, what the left in Chicago would have been much better doing was building for the contract that is up with the Chicago Teachers Union right now. Instead, they took an electoral detour, in my opinion, that pulled them back from the kind of necessary work that they should be doing. That's not an argument against electoral engagement. I'm all for electoral engagement, but I think you have to put it into an overall perspective. And I'll just sort of end by saying this. Philip, going back to the debate we had in our papers last year, said we won't register people for the Democrats. Instead, we'll work with those drawn to Sanders' campaign to fight for 15 single-payer health care and to take on the billionaire class. And I guess I'd like to say, in what way has Socialist Alternative, or the left more generally, been able to bring those drawn to the Sanders campaign into a fight for 15 or single-payer or any other movement? And the answer is we haven't. And that's not our fault. This year, like any other election year, has been marked by the absence of movements. And the Sanders campaign, for all of its being a movement, has not facilitated the development of social struggles, and that has not been its intention. In fact, what a campaign inside a party like the Democratic Party does is it sucks that energy out. And so the question is, in terms of the question of where do we go from here, let's talk about building an independent campaign. The ISO endorsed Jill Stein, months ago, and we are for building an independent campaign. But there's a whole series of challenges and struggles that face us. And I guess I'll just, Lee mentioned it, but 40,000 Verizon workers are on strike right now. This is a battle that is about the future of the working class movement in this country. They are trying to have a PACO again. They are trying to destroy the working class movement. And it's not going to be a glamorous struggle. It's like a solidarity committee of 20 or 30 people. But the work of going to those picket lines, the work of building up rank and file experience and power and a voice in that kind of struggle, the work of going around to other people and bringing other issues into that and all the rest of that is just as critical work. And it's not splashy. And no, we're not speaking to 15,000 people when we're out on the picket line. But we are doing the work that it takes to rebuild the left. And I think there's something, people say we don't choose our moment, but there's something a little sad, if not tragic, about a left that has so little confidence in itself that it can't stand for something. You know what I mean? That it can't stand on principles. No one would ever tell me, don't challenge a racist in my workplace, or because he's a really good union militant and we don't want to undermine him. People would say, that's great that socialists stand up against racism. It's no different with the Democratic Party. It's the same thing. It's about standing for something so that you have something to draw people to. We're never going to be less small. We're never going to be less isolated unless we have the confidence to stand on our own 2 feet and begin the work of building the struggles that are cut off every 4 years when a Democratic politician, for better or for worse, becomes the sort of focal point for that attention. We have to start building our own side, and that's about independent politics and electoral alternatives, but it's also about something more. It's about building a socialist movement in this country that's rooted in a whole range of struggles that can really take advantage and face the challenges of this moment. Oh, and you can get a t-shirt for $20.
So I think the discussion clarified a number of things what this debate is not about. I don't think there's any debate that the Democratic Party is our enemy. I don't think there's any debate that Bernie Sanders is deploying a absolutely incorrect approach of shuttling fresh forces that are not traditionally part of the Democratic Party into the Democratic Party, and that as socialists we want to combat that. I don't think there's any debate that we want to fight for building a political alternative rooted in the interests of the working class to the Democratic Party. That is, I think there's agreement between our organizations. I mean, there's other organizations which have a different, or another planet. But I think our organizations have a similar question about those things. I think we have a similar analysis of Bernie Sanders' political shortcomings on his various positions. The issue is, I think where there is a difference, to be clear, is I think the ISO, I think the question is a question of tactical rigidity or tactical flexibility to effectively fight for those positions that we both share. And I think in general, I think the discussion shows, in my view, some of the sort of tendency of the ISO towards an abstract propagandism and tactical rigidity, which will, despite your intentions, really hamstring the socialist movement from seizing opportunities to fight the Democrats, to build support for independent politics, to build support for socialism if we're trapped in that rigid approach. So to give some examples, in that I agree, the point was raised about, that not supporting Sanders does not mean you can't relate to Sanders supporters, and I agree. And I think that unlike the Sparsis League, the ISO, and I don't mean that is a low bar. I mean, honestly, the ISO, from the materials, adopted a friendly approach to the Sanders campaign, has been able to relate and discuss with Sanders supporters, and we could have, and I agree that we could have done that also without endorsing Sanders. And I agree also there's a price you pay by saying you support Sanders. That's absolutely true if we're having an honest discussion, and that's not our preferred route. I would also say there's a price you pay with the position you've taken, and I'm going to try to explain the advantage we see with the approach we've had, the advantage for combating the Democratic Party, for building support for genuine socialism and against Sanders' misinformed socialism, reforming Democratic Party, reforming capitalism. And the point you raised, Jen, was the Sanders campaign doesn't have, you described, I was talking about the meetings we organized in Seattle. That's not normal. The Sanders campaign doesn't have vibrant political discussions. There's not committees that are being left. Yes, we agree. The question that Socialist Alternative approached it is, we saw there's a potential, though, for that kind of life. That there's the issue is not Bernie Sanders' intentions or his politics. We agree on what they are. The issue is there's these young Sandinistas who are hungry for those political discussions. And the question is, with the tactic that you have reached, how do you access them? And the Sanders campaign does not give us a ready-made access to them because it's not a vibrant campaign which has meetings and structures, etc. I think if it did also, your tactics would cut you off from them. But it doesn't. What we did, the whole spirit of our approach, was to mobilize those people. We had to actually take initiatives. So in Seattle, we did convene meetings when Sanders launched his campaign, and we did this in other parts of the country, in Boston and other cities, where we called meetings. Are you interested in the Sanders campaign? The Sanders campaign was not the ones excited about that. When we did that, we were able to access that audience of fresh people. And we had the platform and linked it to our politics of explaining the Democratic Party is a dead end. Sanders is not going to win the Democratic primaries. He's going to be sabotaged. We are not signing up for the mission of reform. We said there's a debate in the Sanders campaign. There's some people, we did invite left-wing Democrats to share the stage with us, and we had a debate with them, where some people think this campaign should be used to reform the Democratic Party. Us and Socialist Alternative, we are not here for that agenda. We're here for the agenda of a political revolution, and we're serious about that. That means building an alternative to the Democratic Party. That means building a new party in this country. That means not supporting Hillary Clinton if we're proven correct and we can't win the Democratic primaries. If Sanders refuses to do that, that means supporting Jill Stein. So we're coming to a similar conclusion. But the difference in our tactics was it allowed us to call those meetings and have hundreds of people. And later, when the campaign really heated up, and this goes to the question, Danny, what were we signing people up for? We were signing people up for that set of politics. When the campaign started heating up in the primaries, in January, February, March, we organized the Marches for Bernie of 5,000 people in January in Chicago, and another I forget whether it was in February or March, another rally of 5,000 people in Chicago. Rallies here in different parts of the country, thousands of people, where, again, and those marches were not called by the official Sanders campaign. It required a certain initiative, a certain audacity to call them, but we were on the platform and argued at each one of those events, and you can watch the videos of our speakers, and I would challenge, the point was made, yes, we need to relate to movements, but not succumb to them. Absolutely. And I would challenge the comrades to watch the videos of our speakers. Our speakers did not succumb. We said very clearly in each speaking to those rallies of thousands of people, and Shama when she was invited to speak at the Key Arena rally, the rally in Seattle, said very clearly, we will not be supporting Hillary Clinton. We will not be supporting the Democratic Party. We need to build a political alternative to it. For Sanders to win is going to require a massive social upheaval. We need to build movements like Fight for 15, like Black Lives Matter, like the Chicago teachers strike. That was the message we put. So did we have to make a tactical concession of saying we're supporting Sanders to reach that audience? Yes. When we reached that audience, what was the political agenda we were reaching them with? Did we politically concede anything? I would say we did not, and we were more effective in warning left-wing Sanders supporters to not have confidence in the Democratic Party, to say this is a trap, and you need to be prepared to break from that party and advocate for them. And you said, what? Again, Danny asked the question, what were we signing people up? Read our petition. We had 30,000 people signed up for that petition. When we were signing people up, you made the point about people will be getting texts and emails from the Democratic Party. People signing up for our Movement for Bernie petition are not being handed over to the Democratic Party. Those people will be getting texts and petitions to vote for Jill Stein. That is what they're going to be signing up for. And our petition is very clear that we're not supporting a corporate-backed party. We're collecting, when we were at the rally in New York, we were signing people up not for the official Sanders sign-up sheet. We had Movement for Bernie sign-up sheets. And Movement for Bernie was founded as saying we want to build a movement for below for Sanders to win. We want to build a movement of independent of the Democratic Party. That's what Movement for Bernie is. We're fighting for a new party separate from the Democratic Party. When people signed up for that, we have their contact information. We did not hand that information over to the Sanders campaign. So I think there's agreement of what we're aiming for, but what I would challenge the ISO is I think your tactics are not effective. I think it's too rigid, and too of a general propaganda character, not understanding tactics. The question came up about what was our position about voting on the Democrats. And I would say, actually, one thing I would say is self-criticism is I don't think we've, in terms of the way that question was posed, I think we've explained that in our meetings and activities and internally in Social Alternative. We haven't had the chance enough in our public material to explain. So I can understand there's a misunderstanding, but I want to clarify that misunderstanding if there is. I would say we are absolutely correct what we said a year ago, that we are not in the business of signing people up for the Democratic Party, and the fact is we did not do that. So I was, and that was not, and that took a political struggle in the Sanders campaign when we were working with people. It was not the easy position. The majority of people we were working with said quite pragmatically, look, if you want Sanders to win, register as a Democrat, vote in the caucus, etc. And we were very firm on that. We said we're not going to do that. We said we support Sanders, we wish he would win, but the way we're going to do that is we're going to build the BLM protests. We're going to build, by the stronger those protests are, the better Sanders will do. We'll organize debates with Hillary Clinton supporters. We will organize labor for Bernie. We will organize the marches for Bernie. We are not, the whole purpose why we're involved in this is we think we need to build a new party. And we do not support the Democratic Party. I'm not going to join the Democratic Party. I'm not voting. I understand you may, and I think that's a mistake, but it's totally understandable. And if you are a registered Democrat, I would definitely encourage you to vote for Bernie and not for Hillary Clinton. But I also want to have a discussion with you why you should leave the Democratic Party. And I'm not prepared to make that mistake that you're making. And I hope through your experience you'll draw the conclusion it's time to leave the Democratic Party. Now that requires a certain nuance and sophistication that I think goes beyond abstract propaganda. But, and it is a challenge, but I would also again challenge the comrades that struggles will face challenges, and you'll be forced to take shades of gray and not just approach things in black and white to build a successful movement. As I think you've seen a little bit in your experience in CTU and other struggles, that there's a need for some nuance and having different shades of gray. But we were quite clear, and we argued in our different campaigns, in our different meetings, in our organization with the people we brought around us, and we won people out of the Sanders campaign to join Socialist Alternative, work with us, and say, I'm not part of the Democratic Party. And that was our aim, not to encourage people to join the Democratic Party, but we did argue that the Sanders campaign provided an opportunity to fight for those kind of politics. And the final point I will say is, well, just on that, again, and I think the debate, the petition points, the question of the petition that was raised. Do we have any illusions that Sanders is going to run an independent? No. That is not his intention. Is that absolutely ruled out? No. If there's an enormous upsurge, could Sanders be forced to do things he did not imagine he was going to do? Absolutely. And you're wrong to think that he can't be forced to do things. But is that where we're heading? Very unlikely. Very likely Sanders is going to support Clinton, and we're going to be supporting Jill Stein. But the point of that petition is to force a debate among Sanders supporters and try to win them to our position, not have an abstract approach of saying, well, we know what's going to happen, so we'll leave the supporters to his friendly embrace and let him do what he wishes with them. We want to get involved and create a wedge between Sanders supporters and split them from the bad policies and approach he's doing. So I think that's a little bit, I wish I had a little more time to go into. I think that what I'm referring to as an abstract approach and rigidity, I think would be seen in the ISO's hesitation to get involved in the Nader campaign in 2000, actually opposition to it, or in 2004, how the ISO was very slow to get involved, or 2008, the point was raised about Obama, and saying we can relate to people's hope. I don't think enough of an honest position was put to people having hope with Obama that Obama will deeply disappoint, as we did. But I think or with Occupy, a certain hesitation. How do we get involved in this movement that has a populist, anarchist outlook while fighting? How do we get involved in this movement with this confused, dominant character, but argue for socialist politics and class struggle politics? So I think that's part of the ongoing discussion we're going to have, and that's going to be tested in different struggles. But I think this discussion today was helpful in trying to clarify a little bit where there's common ground and what some of the remaining issues are.
You started to talk.